Travis was back at school and enjoyed meeting with his friends again after the long summer break. He told most of them about the great time he had in the Catskills but decided not to let anyone know about his meetings with Tiber. That would require him to embark on many explanations for something that none of his friends or family was likely to understand, no matter what was said. Besides, these lessons with Tiber were personal, and he was not obliged to let anyone in on his secret life. He was only obliged to live Tiber's lessons and not to expound on them. But it was certainly quite hard for Travis to be patient about meeting for a new lesson. He loved the feeling he received when his mind wrapped around the new concepts that Tiber imparted, and he loved the association with this mind master. Travis decided to take a walk along the waterfront near their Brooklyn Heights home with those thoughts on his mind. It was crisp, beautiful Saturday morning, and he didn't have anything planned for the day. His mother had prepared a super good breakfast of strawberry pancakes, patty sausage, and a cup of hot chocolate. His father, a certified financial planner, decided that he needed to go into Manhattan to finish up some work details. His mother is a nurse and was grateful for a weekend off and was planning on settling down in the garden with a good book. Travis wanted to let his mother have the house to herself for a little while so she could enjoy reading. As he strolled along the promenade, he gazed out over the New York harbor and, as always, admired the magnificent view of the Manhattan skyline. It was a grand day, but oddly enough not too many people were on the promenade. Travis walked over to an empty bench under some shade trees and sat down, enjoying the fact that he owned the bench all to himself. A soft breeze drifted over this spot that delivered a sensation that was not cool and not warm but just plain perfect. As he looked at the skyline across the harbor, Travis could not believe that the scene could be as tranquil as it appeared. Millions of people milling about in and around those buildings, but there was no indication of that from where he was sitting, and the scene was more like a picture-perfect postcard setting. Travis was so composed sitting in this place, and he became immersed in remembering the past experiences with Tiber and found himself getting impatient and wanting him to show up once more to give him a lesson. He looked around the area and focused on every bird landing in the tree canopy above his head. He also observed those birds zooming by his bench on the way to somewhere to find a bit to eat. None of them appeared to be Tiber in disguise. He also spotted some squirrels darting down from the trees and scampering across the promenade to leap up the picket fence. Travis always loved watching their antics and was waiting to see if one of them would morph into Tiber, his friend and mentor. None did. After several minutes had passed, an elderly woman in a wheelchair came rolling towards Travis. She smiled as she spun her hands on one wheel and maneuvered her wheelchair next to his bench on its open end. He looked at her in a somewhat mystified look. Parking this close to someone on a bench was a very familiar action, and he had never seen her before. She looked directly into his eyes and wished him a good morning using Tiber's voice.
I thought I would find you here waiting for me. You miss me, didn't you? Admit it.
Yes, I missed you, but I am somewhat taken aback by seeing you sitting in a wheelchair and as an older woman as well. I have to say, however, that I didn't expect this, but I also have to tell you that you look better as elderly women than you did like the middle-aged man that I met in our previous meetings.
That's unfair. In actuality, I look fabulous in every appearance I make. I put a lot of effort into creating my representations, even when I am an animal. I know for a fact that you liked me as a mountain lion, a significantly antlered buck, and a hawk. You even seemed to admire my dragonfly appearance at our last lesson.
Yeah, you are correct. And you are pretty good at what you do. But I am used to seeing the animals and not sure that meeting with me while in drag is your best introduction technique to date.
Come on. I knew that we would discuss the ego in this session, but it's not very nice for you to try and smash mine so quickly. You could at least have waited until we had spent some time discussing the subject. Oh, and by the way, my name is Fanny.
Of course it is, but I'm not going to play along with you and even begin to call you by that name. You are still Tiber to me, and if you could change your appearance during our past lessons, I would respectfully ask you to do the same during this one.
And with that, Tiber morphed into the professor that Travis knew so well by now. He was still in the wheelchair.
Okay, you don't need that wheelchair. You are just trying to make me have some sympathy for you, and it won't work.
Damn, it is so hard to get some respect from mouthy students.
And with that, He telescoped up from the wheelchair and was standing alongside the bench. The wheelchair had disappeared.
Is this better?
Much.
Now, let's get down to business.
Tiber started.
We're going to talk today about your ego. Do you know what an ego is?
I guess so. At least I know what almost everyone thinks the ego is when they talk about it.
And that is,
I believe that the ego is a self-image type of consciousness that almost everyone uses to identify themselves. When people want to describe who or what they are to themselves or others, the ego comes to their mind. Is that it?
it's a good starting point and spoken very well. I am surprised a bit as most people cannot get that close to an explanation on the first try. But having said that, your description is somewhat faulty primarily because it is somewhat limited. The ego was a necessary construct to have when you are born because you needed to develop a unique cultural identity, and ego will assist you in creating one. But please note that you have an ego, but you are not an ego. Each new baby will have to wake up in a society of some kind, and he or she must be required to fit into that society. If a baby were born with a preset identity of some other culture, it would have one hell of a time getting assimilated into a different environment. Other animals, however, as a general rule, do not require the flexibility of having to fit into an unknown environment. For example, no matter where a cat is born, it will fit right in and act like a cat. They will automatically find a cat box or an appropriate place to relieve themselves and where they can cover it up. They will incessantly groom themselves and do not require a parent to teach them how. Cats and other animals may have personalities, but they don't have egos. How nice is that? Does this make sense to you?
Yep.
So, in the case of human beings, having an ego will help you adjust and fit into a unique environment and culture that, of course, you are not familiar with. Ego is an essential thing to have to assist that baby in assimilating into the new society while still creating a unique personality. However, having an ego comes with a few difficulties and, in some cases, a major amount of problems. Ego will help you develop individuality for the specific life that you are experiencing. You carry it with you until you die, and you will carry the ego characteristics with you when you pass over. But an ego will also sometimes fixate on the wrong characteristics, and the individual ego will start to dominate that individuality when it shouldn't. For example, it is a good thing to be competitive to a reasonable degree, but the ego can fixate on that characteristic and force the individual to attempt to win at all costs. It is also a good thing for an individual to fit into a society or culture, but not a good thing to want to dominate a society or culture at all costs, or conversely to give up trying to fit in when an individual is defeated.
Tiber relaxed for a moment and then continued.
You will ultimately have a composite individuality acquired from all of the different incarnations that you have experienced through the different lifetimes. This can be a good thing if your individualities have been positive for the most part, but not so good if you have primarily been experiencing negative individualities. Essentially, within each incarnation you experience, the weaker and under your control, your ego is the better. The out-of-control ego is always bad. Travis, do you follow me so far?
Yep.
I'm overwhelmed by your philosophical input. Surely you must have some questions about this very complex subject matter.
Nope.
Okay, I can't wait until the test at the end of this lesson to take that smirk off of your face.
Then Tiber cleared his voice and continued.
Many of my students have asked me why the ego is even needed, and I have often repeated what I said earlier to them and to you. Each soul must develop an individual character that is their own, and that requires that the consciousness of each soul to have a way that sets them apart from the consciousness of other souls. Unlike the cat I mentioned, it isn't enough to have a distinct personality. It is imperative that each consciousness is unique and one created by their own experiences. Having an inherent ego for each soul is a pretty neat way to accomplish this, but it does require that the individual soul's consciousness, and that be you, my boy, to keep a tight rein on your ego while you are developing. It is, after all, just a tool for your development, just like your body. and it must be under your control and not the other way around. How foolish it would be for you to be under the control of your body, and how equally foolhardy it will be to allow your consciousness to be under the control of your ego. But mark my words, Travis, the ego will rule you if you don't rule it. Understand?
I do. I just wanted to listen without answering too much to determine if you knew what you were teaching. I guess you do.
Smartass.
But I do have another question. How do you keep your ego under your control when it sure seems as though it is lurking somewhere in your mind and sneaks up on you and grabs your attention without you even knowing?
Excellent question. The answer is to reveal to you that the ego's defense against you controlling it is for the ego to keep you unaware that it is under your control all along. Its power resides in your habit of ignoring its presence. You have to be aware of the ego's existence and make an effort to remind it that it is under your control at all times and not the other way around. You control your body. You control your mind. You control your daily activities, and on and on. Don't make your ego the one thing you don't try to control. A contemporary author by the name of Eckhart Tolle wrote, "All that is required to become free of the ego is to be aware of it, since awareness and ego are incompatible."
Wow. That's pretty cool. How come our school or our families don't teach us about this ego business?
That is the result of a simple fact. I don't know why people don't want to see that reality. They just don't. However, allowing the ego to take control from time to time also serves as a dual learning purpose for the soul. The ego manifesting itself tends to be negative more than it does a positive nature attribute. Having an individual soul recognizing that fact is an extremely strong and important learning experience. The ego can also be counted on to push the boundaries, and this often wakes an individual soul up whenever that transgression occurs, if they are paying attention. That is why we keep saying that to be aware of the ego is the first step to controlling it and, more importantly, keeping your ego from controlling you.
Tiber took another break for just a moment and then continued again.
That oversight capability is also quite valuable in monitoring other souls as well. For example, it is relatively easy to recognize an individual controlled by their ego rather than its inherent consciousness. Take the leader or would-be leader of a country as an illustration. Suppose you are aware of the influence of an out-of-control ego on a soul. In that case, it's not difficult to see it negatively manifested in that leader's utterings or actions. You can sense with quite good accuracy if a person is primarily a positive or negative personality by observing their expressions reflecting a control by their ego. That's why ultimately, a democratic system of government is preferable to any other kind, because a voter that is paying attention can make a far better decision than one who does not pay attention to a candidate. Unfortunately, too many citizens use other influences, such as party affiliations or personal interests, as the primary reason to vote other than by paying attention to the outward manifestations of an ego-driven candidate and voting for or against that candidate as they decide best. A leader controlled by ego is a far greater danger than one who controls their ego, because that means they are not controlling themselves. That's a very scary proposition.
Travis nodded his head before answering.
I am amazed and really impressed. I have often watched some of my friends and many adults that seem to act improperly and very out of character to how I thought they were most of the time. You have given me a possible reason why this has taken place. How do I react to them when this happens? Do I tell them about their ego taking control?
No. You don't do that, because their ego is obviously in control during that moment, and that confrontation will force the ego to become defensive to protect its interests. You have two good ways to counter the situation. The first is to control your ego by acting and talking from your consciousness. By this demonstration, you will be telling your friends or others that you are in control of your actions. They will recognize this occurring better than you might think. The other way is to communicate appropriately by discussing how the ego functions without direct reference to the individual you are having the conversation with. Having that person considering what the ego is, often leads them to a probable situation where they will start to control their ego. That's a far greater chance of success if you use those two options of influence rather than a confrontation.
Wow! That was also a super cool lesson. I feel that I am totally in control of my ego now and can even have a chance of helping others having problems with their egos.
Travis, you can rein that horse in a bit. This was a good lesson, but understanding and controlling yours or another's ego is far more complex and requires more study and practice, as do most spiritual achievements. Your immediate answer to me was a bit influenced by your ego, but I am confident that you are on your way and going in the right direction. But I have to leave now and attend to other matters. Do you have a preference for the next lesson's subject matter?
Sure. Let's make it sex.
Lordy, I was afraid you were going to say that, but I suppose that would come up one of these times. But that's okay, I guess. Please give me a big hug. I'll see you later, Gator.
And Travis stood up and gave Tiber a heavy hug and felt the seemingly solid body dissolve into an effervescent mistiness. As usual, Travis felt very satisfied after having spent some quality time with his teacher and his friend. It was interesting to read how strong our egos are and how effective the ego can sometimes send us down the wrong path. I was also surprised that we need to have an ego, mainly when growing from a baby to a young adult. Travis is interested in sex being the subject of the next lesson. Are we surprised? And are we likely to learn anything new about this subject? You can bet that we will, because this teacher knows more about us than we know. So please come along with us and join in on a fascinating and quite amusing episode number 6. It won't be a lesson like you think it might be. Please visit our website, theemeraldcrystal.com, to see, read, or hear more of our literary offerings. You may also purchase our spiritual thriller novels, Quest for the Emerald Crystal Boon No. 1, Spiritual Warriors in the Bahamas, or Quest for the Emerald Crystal Book No. 2, Spiritual Warriors in Belize, and Quest for the Emerald Crystal Book No. 3, Spiritual Warriors in the Caribbean, within our website or on Amazon.com.